I usually preach in series, as you know. Last month we finished a series on frequently asked questions. Next month we're going to do a series on Mission Possible, the radical implications for being a mission-oriented church. But this month is a smorgasbord. It's potpourri. It's things I think you will find fun, things that you will find, I hope, practical, interesting. Today we're going to talk about sayings that say something. Now, have you ever been hiking on an unknown trail, and you walk and you walk and you walk, and the sun is starting to go down, and a little thought goes into your mind, did I wander off onto the 8-mile trail instead of the 2-mile that you thought you were on? And so you start walking a little faster, the sun is going down, your lungs start beating, or your heart starts beating faster, and you start hyperventilating. Have you ever done that? I, of course, haven't. It's an awful feeling. And had I experienced that, I would so have wished that the trail would have been marked better, as in, go this way, or you're almost home, things like that. Sayings that say something are like trail markers. They help us understand the trail that we're on. They give us direction. They give us encouragement. A saying that says something comes from someone who's been on that trail before. Someone who can say, yeah, it's just around the corner, you're going to see this, etc. You will note that not too many sayings that say something come from children. You simply have to have experience. For example, a group of children were asked to complete different popular sayings. One child responded, well, here's a saying, it's always darkest before daylight savings time. You can't teach an old dog new. You can't teach an old dog new math. I agree. A penny saved is not much. Let's see here. You have nothing to fear but your principle. Finally, my favorite, a bird in the hand is going to poop on you. Come to think of it, there might be some wisdom in some of those childhood responses. It takes experience to come up with and really appreciate a bit of succinct wisdom that come into the Proverbs, the sayings. So what we're going to do today is to talk about some of the modern Proverbs, and then we're going to compare and contrast them to the ancient ones. Now, several weeks ago in an e-blast, I invited you to share with me favorite sayings that have meant something to you. Many of you sent back I received a veritable plethora of those sayings. If you would like, you may turn to the back of your bulletin where you see the sermon notes and the scripture text, and you'll see a box that has number 1 and number 2. As you hear these sayings that church members from Manchester submitted, 1 or 2 might strike your fancy, as they say, and you can jot them down. Here now, the wisdom from Manchester members.
We can do no great things, only small things with great love.
If you got it out, put it back.
It is what it is, but it will become what you make it.
It is better to be silent and thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt.
When you blame others, you give up your power to change.
You can't fake the harvest.
To love what you do and feel that it matters, what could be more fun?
Words once spoken can never be recalled.
What you say isn't nearly as loud as what you do.
Worry does not empty tomorrow of its troubles. It empties today of its strength.
Expecting the world to treat you fairly because you are good is like expecting the bull not to charge because you're a vegetarian.
You make a living by what you get. You make a life by what you give.
Kill them with kindness.
The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall.
When in doubt, don't.
If you want to know who you are, watch your feet.
The highest form of ignorance is when you reject something you know nothing about.
Not all who wander are lost.
Just because everyone else has it doesn't mean you need to have it too.
Progress always involves risk. You can't steal second base with your foot on first.
All labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance, and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence.
We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are.
All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing.
The best and most beautiful things in this world are not seen or heard, only felt with the heart.
You must be the change you wish to see in the world.
Some pretty smart members here at Manchester UMC. Hope you noted one or two of them. We have all of them listed on an insert that, well, actually a printed half page that you can find on the Welcome Center in the back if you wish. But what you circled or what you pick up, you might want to display in a prominent spot so that wisdom can be in front of you for this next week or so. Now let's contrast what you just heard with Proverbs that came about 1,500, 1,600 years ago. Wait a second. No, I think I have that wrong. Proverbs that came about 2,500 years ago. Yeah, that sounds much better. Proverb, by the way, is an interesting word. It comes from pro, meaning forth ahead, and verb, meaning word. So a proverb is a saying that comes before you to guide you. And the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament contains 31 chapters of these wise sayings. The ones you're about to hear from the 25th chapter are attributed to King Solomon. Hear now the word of the Lord.
When you're given a box of candy, don't gulp it all down. Eat too much chocolate and you're going to make yourself sick.
And when you find a friend, don't outwear your welcome. Show up at all hours and he'll get fed up.
Singing light songs to the heavy-hearted is like pouring salt in their wounds.
If you see an enemy hungry, go buy him lunch. If he's thirsty, buy him a drink. Your generosity will surprise him with goodness, and God will look after you.
A north wind brings stormy weather, and a gossipy tongue, stormy looks.
Better to live alone in a tumble-down shack than share a mansion with a nagging spouse.
Like a cool drink of water when you're worn out and weary is a letter from a long-lost friend.
A good person who gives in to a bad person is a muddied spring, a polluted well.
A person without self-control is like a house with its doors and windows knocked out.
Thank you. You might like to have the book of Proverbs as your summer reading. 31 chapters. You might want to take a couple of chapters a week or so and see where it leads you. Where these sayings lead us right now is to this point. I would invite you to, if you've put away that sermon notes scripture section, to get it back out, and I want you to underline or at least note some very key words in the sayings you heard. Number one, I invite you to underline the word friend. Friend is found in two places in the passage of Proverbs. When you find a friend, don't outwear your welcome. That's sort of like Ben Franklin's admonition in Poor Richard's Almanac, fish and guests smell after 3 days. And like a cool drink of water, when you're worn out, weary is a letter, a text, a tweet, a call, a Facebook post from a long-lost friend. But I would challenge what you see on the screen. If a friend is really a friend, could he or she ever outwear their welcome? And if a friend is really a friend, why would that friend be lost in the first place? Now, I think there's a better definition of friendship than the one that King Solomon gave. There's a better saying for friendship than the one King Solomon gave, and it comes from someone who knew quite a bit about being a friend. Greater love has no one than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. If you have a relationship of Christian love with someone, then they will never outwear their welcome and they will never be lost in the first place. Greater love. A reflection on friendship. Here's something else that you can underline. Enemy. If you see your enemy hungry, buy him lunch. Give him a drink of water. Now, you might note that in the trivia night that we had, there's that contest of heads or tails. If you hear a verse and you think it's from the Old Testament, you put your hand on your head, and if you think it's from the New, you put it on your tail, heads or tails. Well, this would trick me, because that's supposed to be from the New Testament, right? What's this thing about the Old Testament having love your enemy? Old Testament is about vengeance and wrath and an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Could it be that there really is that strain of compassionate love and love your neighbor unconditionally that runs throughout the Old Testament? Could it be that section or those passages that have something about vengeance and an eye for an eye, could that be more of a reflection of culture than divine will? Maybe. Because we know that in Jesus, that which is seen sometimes hidden fashion in the Old Testament comes out in great tones of color in the New. When Jesus said, love your enemies, don't just give to them, love them, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be child of your Father in heaven, your Father in the Old Testament, your Father in the New Testament. Incidentally, I think maybe King Solomon might have said, yeah, be good to your enemies, but do you think he was? Do you think a king can be merciful to enemies? Don't think so. But King Jesus, who is still alive, certainly exemplified that, even with, Father, forgive them. Just a thought. Here's something else you can underline. Gossipy tongue. There is a very strong sentiment in the Bible about watching your tongue, especially when you hear someone bad-mouthing someone else. The sense of that phrase that you see up there, that saying, in Palestine, if you felt a wind coming from the north, then you could be assured that there were dark clouds, thunder, lightning, i.e. outside, following it. Well, when you feel hot air coming from someone else, insulting or criticizing someone who was not there to defend himself or herself, then you don't just sit and agree with it. You stop it right there and you confront that person. There is no room to accentuate and to accelerate gossip, period. You bring about that stormy look and you let that person know, well, what would that person think that you're talking about if he or she were here? Would you still say the same thing? We owe it, if we're Christians, we owe it to that person who is absent to stand up for himself or herself and give that person benefit of the doubt. James in the New Testament put it this way: no one can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. We have to help others tame their tongue just as we need their help in taming our own. Finally, self-control. You might want to look up that in the passage for today. Underline it. Self-control. A person without self-control is like a house with its doors and windows knocked out. The New Revised Standard Version of it is this: a person without, go back, yep, thank you. A person without self-control is like a city that doesn't have any walls to protect it. Isn't that interesting? Or without an army to protect it. You did not have ADT or ABF security systems back in ancient Palestine. You had to make sure that your shutters could be locked and your doors shut against robbers. You did not have radar or monitoring systems in the sky, satellites, to determine when the enemy is going to come into your town or your area. You had to be on guard. Peter, centuries later, said this: discipline yourselves, keep alert, because like a roaring lion, your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour. You think that's just old talk? Well, I have to tell you, I'm concerned for my children. Because there is, maybe you don't put it in literal terms about a devil poking you with a pitchfork. Who knows? But I do know the temptations out there to let your doors be wide open and your windows and the walls down are out there, because there's the power of peer pressure. There's the lure of alcohol and drugs. There's the lifestyle of pleasure without responsibility. There's the push toward greed and materialism and seeing yourself in terms of dollar signs instead of heart signs. It's everywhere. And unless a person has self-control, and self-control comes from being grounded in values that are grounded in faith, that is lived out in a disciplined life, then I am scared for my children. I'm scared for me. I'm scared for you. Look at what you're doing here. You are here when it would have been easier to sleep in because it's dark outside, right? You're here with a spiritual discipline of worship and of praising God. You're grounding yourself in the faith that leads to values that are not negotiable, that leads to that discipline that can resist the world and enable a fuller life. You embody that for yourself, for your children, and for the others within this community. Self-control isn't optional. Discipline is not optional. It is mandatory, especially in the times in which we live. Sayings that say something. I hope you've noted a few of them, especially from our friends quoting Proverbs. Take them home, print them out, maybe some in big, bold letters so that you will be reminded. But ultimately, in the last word, we have to remember that we haven't even touched on the two greatest sayings of all. Once upon a time, a man came to Jesus and said, "Master, tell us, what is the greatest saying of all?" He actually said, "What's the greatest commandment?" Sort of a tricky question. And Jesus, without flinching, answered in an unusual way. He said, number one, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. But then he quickly added, and the second is just as important, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then the twist. It was, on these two sayings rest all the laws and the prophets. On those two sayings rest all the sayings that say something. Don't you agree?